Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're taking a quiet trip back through time to explore some surprisingly gross but strangely interesting facts about how people used to stay clean. These are the little everyday parts of history that don't often get much attention. Don't worry though. Our journey will be slow, calm, and relaxing. This is History at Night, meant to ease you into rest. All you have to do is listen, unwind, and maybe even fall asleep as I gently talk about the messy side of ancient life. There will be no loud sounds or sudden changes, just a soft, steady rhythm as we learn about how long ago people dealt with hygiene, or didn't. You might even find yourself chuckling a bit, because let's be honest, some of these old habits were quite strange or gross, but everything will be shared in a slow and peaceful tone. Imagine an old librarian reading you odd but harmless bedtime facts. You'll hear about strange bathroom customs, weird old remedies, and the unusual ways people try to fight off smells and grime. As odd as it all sounds, it will be told in a gentle, steady way. So you can simply rest, close your eyes, and let your thoughts drift. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Our journey tonight will gently wander through the past, exploring how different cultures approached staying clean, often in ways that are both clever and a little unpleasant. We'll start with the neat and sometimes surprising routines of ancient Egypt, visit the bustling shared bathrooms of ancient Rome, and take a closer look at the creative and occasionally gross habits of ancient China. We'll pass through the grimy streets of medieval Europe and even glance at other corners of the world, like the smart sewage systems of the Indus Valley or how the Aztecs handled hygiene in their grand cities. Each part of this soft historical stroll will blend smoothly into the next, flowing like a gentle stream through time and space. If you feel sleepy, don't worry, you don't need to keep track. Just let the sound of my voice carry you steady and low. Some of what we cover might seem a bit yucky if you think about it too much, but I'll keep things mild and oddly comforting. And maybe, just maybe, hearing how dirty life used to be will help you feel even more cozy in your nice clean bed. So get comfy, settle in, and let this oddly relaxing dive into history's messier moments ease you into rest. Let's begin, slowly and gently, with one of the world's earliest and most graceful civilizations, ancient Egypt, a land known for its elegance, golden temples, and as you'll soon learn, some very interesting habits when it came to staying clean. The Egyptians took hygiene seriously, almost obsessively so. By the standards of their time, they were what we might call clean freaks. People bathed often, sometimes in the Nile, sometimes in private tubs. Wealthier families even had their own bathrooms. Priests in particular washed several times a day as part of their religious duties. For Egyptians, being clean was not only practical, it was spiritual. Cleanliness honored the gods and helped them deal with the heat and pests of life along the river. They didn't have soap like we do, but they used clay or a special salt called natron, mixed with water, to scrub their skin. Afterward, they'd apply sweet-smelling oils or perfumes. Picture a nobleman or lady standing in a shaded courtyard as a servant pours cool water over their body, followed by a rub down with scented oils made from lotus or jasmine. It sounds like a spa, and in a way it was, but it was also about smelling nice and staying comfortable in the dry desert air. To go even further, the wealthy sometimes wore small cones of perfumed fat on top of their wigs. As the day wore on, the fat would melt slowly, releasing a gentle fragrance over their hair and clothing. Strange by today's standards, but it worked. Hair care was just as important and surprisingly practical. Lice were everywhere in the ancient world, and Egyptians weren't having it. So many rich Egyptians shaved their heads completely. Men, women, anyone who could afford it, went bald. They even removed body hair. This wasn't about beauty. It was about avoiding pests. And instead of letting the world see their bald heads, they wore beautifully crafted wigs when they wanted to look fancy. So, even though ancient Egypt dazzles us with gold and splendor, it was also full of smart, sometimes odd methods of staying clean. Now, let's keep moving gently forward toward the marble baths and shared sponges of ancient Rome. These wigs, often made from real human hair or sometimes horsehair, offered a clever solution to a messy problem. They could be taken off, cleaned separately, or even thrown away if they became too infested with lice. Far easier than trying to delouse your own hair. Imagine a graceful Egyptian woman reclining at a banquet, her head adorned with a thick, dark wig woven with gold threads. What you don't see is the smooth, shaved scalp underneath. It was beauty with a purpose. Of course, wigs could still attract lice, but unlike real hair, they could be boiled or carefully picked over without the discomfort of bites on the scalp. In tomb paintings, we often see scenes of servants grooming their wealthy masters, likely removing insects from wigs or rubbing scented oils onto bald heads. Staying clean in ancient Egypt wasn't easy, especially with all the bugs, but it was part of everyday life. Their focus on hygiene didn't stop with hair. Even dental care mattered, though their methods might make us squirm. Ancient Egyptians noticed that sugary dates and bread made with gritty, stone-ground flour often caused tooth decay or worn-down teeth. So they came up with one of the world's first kinds of toothpaste, really more of a tooth powder. But the ingredients weren't exactly minty fresh. A typical mix might include crushed eggshells, ground-up ox hooves, some ashes, and maybe a little myrrh to make it smell better. This grainy powder was rubbed onto the teeth using a finger or a twig. It might have done the job, at least a little, though it probably tasted like campfire dust. There's even evidence they used primitive toothbrushes, basically sticks with frayed ends, to scrub their teeth. No fluoride or floss, of course, but they certainly made the effort to avoid rotten teeth and painful aches. Still, for all their impressive routines, not everything about ancient Egyptian hygiene was so clean. There are things you won't often see in glossy museum displays, like the bathrooms. In a wealthy household, you might find a carved limestone toilet seat resting above a simple clay bowl or a shallow pit. Yes, they had toilets of a sort. The setup was basic: a seat with a hole and a pot of sand underneath. After doing their business, they'd cover the waste with sand, much like a cat in a litter box. Servants would then empty the container and clean the area, tossing the waste into a pit, or more likely, into the river. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't odor-free, but it beat going directly on the ground. Poorer people likely just squatted outdoors or used clay pots they emptied each morning. There was no running water to flush anything away. Most waste ended up in cesspits or was carried off by the Nile. You can picture the quieter stretches of riverbanks tucked away from view, where people relieved themselves and let the water wash everything downstream. Not the cleanest system, but it worked. Sort of. When it came to wiping, Egyptians used whatever was handy. Smooth stones or broken pottery shards were common, though they sound painful to us. Leaves, grass, or even just rinsing with water were other options. Since water was such a central part of their idea of cleanliness, washing afterward was often preferred when possible. Archaeologists have even uncovered pottery that might have been used as personal water-pouring vessels, early tools for post-bathroom hygiene. And if you were very wealthy, you might even have a servant whose job was, believe it or not, to help you in the bathroom. So while ancient Egypt was full of elegance, fragrance, and ritual, it was also full of inventive, if sometimes unpleasant, ways to handle the realities of daily life. With water and towels on hand, cleanliness in ancient Egypt could get surprisingly personal. In fact, some historical records suggest that within the pharaoh's palace, there were special servants or medics dedicated entirely to the royal rear end. Yes, you heard that right. The mighty pharaoh, the living god on earth, had someone officially titled Guardian of the Anus. It sounds like a joke, but this role appears in real Egyptian medical texts. This person was basically a digestive health specialist, responsible for giving the pharaoh enemas to keep his bowels working smoothly. Enemas were a regular part of Egyptian medicine. Using a tube, they gently pump water or herbal mixtures into the rectum to flush things out. Egyptians believed it was healthy to clean out the insides now and then. So somewhere in the luxurious palaces of Akhenaten or Ramses the Great, someone had the very royal and very messy job of preparing warm water or oil and helping the king stay regular. Strange as it sounds today, the position was probably considered a high honor. Even gods on earth had everyday human needs. But Egyptian hygiene didn't stop at the royal bottom. It extended into the world of medicine and beauty in ways that might turn our stomachs now. While their attention to cleanliness was admirable, they didn't know about germs or modern sanitation. Some of their treatments, while well-meaning, were rather questionable. Take wound care, for example. Healers often used honey, which is actually a good idea since honey can fight bacteria, but they'd mix it with things like animal fat or even dried dung. Yes, animal dung. They believed that it had magical or healing powers. In reality, it likely caused more infections than it cured, since dung is packed with harmful bacteria. Still, medical texts from the time include recipes with crocodile droppings or other fecal matter. It seems shocking, but remember, they were doing their best with the knowledge they had. If something seemed to work once, they kept using it. Unfortunately, it took a very long time before people figured out that dung and open wounds don't mix. And speaking of crocodile dung, brace yourself. This particular substance played another, even stranger role in ancient Egyptian hygiene. It was used as a kind of birth control. That's right. Ancient Egyptian women sometimes used contraceptive pessaries made of crocodile dung. It might sound like a bad joke, but it's a real historical practice described in ancient texts. The mixture, made of crocodile droppings combined with honey or sour milk, was inserted into the vagina before intercourse, acting as a sort of barrier. The theory might have been that it would block sperm physically, or that the dung's alkaline nature created a hostile environment for fertilization. Amazingly, crocodile dung is slightly alkaline, similar to some modern spermicides. So weirdly enough, it might have actually had some effect. But let's be honest, it was also sticky, messy, and probably smelled horrible. It's hard to imagine a less romantic form of protection. Still, in a time without many options, this was an inventive, if cringe-inducing, solution. So as we drift through the winding halls of Egyptian palaces and peer into their ancient medical jars, we see a people devoted to staying clean, curing ailments, and managing life's messier moments, with methods that often walked the line between ingenious and gross. But even a civilization as grand as Egypt wasn't spared from the constant battle with pests. Homes, including the luxurious ones, were never fully sealed. Mice, rats, and insects slipped in with ease. Food had to be protected from rats. Bedrooms were often smoked with incense at night to keep away mosquitoes, since malaria and other diseases were real threats. If you were wealthy, you might sleep under a linen canopy or mosquito net, not just for comfort, but to keep from waking up covered in bites. Think of it as the original bug screen, elegant and essential. As for lice, we've already covered the widespread habit of shaving heads and wearing wigs. But fleas were also a major problem, especially with beloved pets like cats and dogs roaming indoors. Egyptians adored their animals, especially cats, which were even worshipped. But with pets came pests. To fight fleas, they burned herbs and resins, filling rooms with smoke meant to drive the insects out. Some folk remedies even suggested washing in animal urine to soothe flea bites. Whether that was common or just one of many odd suggestions, we can't say for sure. Body odor was another challenge in a hot, buggy land. To manage it, Egyptians used oils scented with things like cinnamon, citrus, or crushed flowers. An early form of deodorant might involve a salve rubbed into the armpits, part fragrance, part function. Perfume wasn't just for the elite. Even the tired labourer who'd spent the day dragging stones at a temple might rinse off in the Nile and rub on a few mint leaves, doing his best to smell decent after a hard day. And then there was bad breath. Thanks to gritty bread that wore down their teeth and caused gum disease, many Egyptians struggled with dental issues. To mask the odor, they created breath fresheners using frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon, rolled into little balls they could chew, so if you were chatting with a noble, you might smell sweet perfume and spicy cinnamon, all covering up the deeper, less pleasant odors of poor dental health. So, what do we make of all this? Ancient Egyptian hygiene was a curious mix of forward-thinking habits and gross improvisations. They bathed often, valued cleanliness, and took grooming seriously. But they also used substances that would make most of us gag, like animal waste and sour milk, if they thought it might help. It's an odd contrast, a culture that worshipped beauty and purity, while coexisting daily with filth and strong smells. Picture a morning in Thebes or Memphis. Golden light over the Nile, palm trees rustling, people in fresh linen going about their day. But also imagine the less lovely details. The trash tossed in the river, buzzing flies at the market, the thick air of incense, sweat, and cooking meat at a festival. It was a world of splendor and stench, elegance and earthiness. And with that, we leave behind the banks of the Nile and gently sail west across the Mediterranean. Take a deep, modern breath, as far away from crocodile dung as you can get, as we arrive at our next stop, a land of philosophers and mighty stone baths, a world that embraced communal hygiene with impressive infrastructure, and a few very questionable practices of its own. Next, we explore ancient Greece and Rome, where cleanliness was shared and dirty secrets were hidden in plain sight. While toilet arrangements might seem shocking to modern sensibilities, they reflect the improvisational and utilitarian spirit of Greek hygiene. Chamber pots and street drains were the norm, and while there was some understanding of cleanliness, there was limited infrastructure to support more sanitary systems. That's part of why bathing and anointing became so central, rituals to freshen the body and perhaps mask the less pleasant realities of daily life. As we drift from Greek courtyards and gymnasiums to the sprawling cities of Rome, we find both improvement and irony. The Romans, inheriting much from Greek practices, expanded on them dramatically. Public bathhouses, known as thermae, became major civic centers where rich and poor alike gathered not only to cleanse but to socialize, conduct business, and relax. These baths included hot rooms, caldarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, and cold plunges, frigidarium, all maintained by complex underground heating systems called hypocausts. Water was supplied by Rome's famous aqueducts and drained into an extensive sewer network. Still, even with this advanced plumbing, Roman hygiene wasn't always pristine. Communal sponges on sticks, called tersoria, were used in public latrines in place of toilet paper. These were rinsed in a bucket of vinegar or salt water and reused, a thought that might turn even the hardiest stomach today. The same sponge that served one person in the morning could easily be your turn by midday, and though bathhouses were grand and elaborate, the water wasn't always changed frequently, leading to concerns even among ancient authors about skin diseases being passed along in the murky pools. Roman barbershops, public urinals, and even communal vomitoria, yes, spaces where people could purge to keep eating at feasts, also dotted the cityscape, all serving particular aspects of hygiene and bodily management. Perfumes and scented oils, as in Greece, were widely used, sometimes to mask, rather than remove, unpleasant smells. Romans even used powdered chalk and vinegar to clean teeth, though dental decay remained common due to grain-heavy diets. So, while Greece had its olive oil scrapers and paisoi, Rome had its sponges, hypocausts, and sewer gods. Each civilization believed itself to be the height of culture, yet both dealt daily with the basic facts of human biology in ways we might today call unsanitary. Still, their efforts to stay clean, fragrant, and presentable reveal a shared human desire to rise above the messiness of life, if only for a little while. Here's a hilarious and slightly gross fact. The Greeks didn't just dislike their enemies, they wiped with them, literally. Broken pottery scraps, ostraka, originally used to vote out unpopular politicians, were later repurposed as ancient toilet paper, paisoi. Imagine scratching the name Aristes onto a shard, and then putting it to the most undignified use. Talk about dragging someone's name through the mud. Sure, it was thrifty, better than littering, but let's just say these wipes weren't exactly cushy. Archaeologists suspect hemorrhoids were a common Greek complaint, thanks to scrubbing with ceramic. Ouch. Cleanliness. Sort of. Greeks tried to stay fresh, stomping laundry in tubs, dumping waste outside city walls, and dousing streets in perfume to mask the stench. They blamed bad air for disease, not totally wrong, since rot bred germs. But narrow streets doubled as sewers, piled with dung, trash, and yes, more pottery shards. Rain or poor scavengers were the only clean-up crew. Enter the Romans, fancy, but still filthy. The Romans upgraded Greek habits with aqueducts, baths, and flowing water toilets. Impressive, yet questionable. Their beloved bathhouses, thermae, were social hubs, steam rooms, hot pools, and strigils for scraping grime off. But the water changed maybe once a day. Bacteria thrived in the warm, murky pools, where hundreds soaked daily. So while Rome's sanitation beat most ancient cities, their spa days were far from sterile. Next time you complain about scratchy toilet paper, remember, it could have been ceramic. The ancient Romans took communal bathing to a whole new level, and by that, we mean a rather questionable soup of sweat, oils, and whatever else hundreds of daily bathers left behind. Contemporary writers often complained about the murky, smelly bath water, with one poet joking you really didn't want to know what was floating in those public pools. Without modern filtration, the best they could do was keep water slowly flowing through the baths. Though in smaller establishments, you were essentially soaking in a days-old human stew. Cleaning methods didn't help matters. Romans didn't use soap, instead coating themselves in oil before scraping off the grime with a strigil, leaving behind piles of oily sludge on the bathhouse floors. The most bizarre detail, wealthy women supposedly collected gladiators' sweat and arena dust as a prized beauty treatment. While we can't verify how common this was, the fact it became a running joke in Roman literature tells you everything about their comfort level with shared bodily fluids. When nature called, Romans faced an even more cringe-worthy situation. Their multi-seat public toilets offered zero privacy, just long stone benches with holes where people would casually chat while doing their business. But the real horror was the tersorium, a shared sponge on a stick used for wiping. These communal cleaning tools would be rinsed in a vinegar water channel between uses, meaning dozens of strangers might use the same sponge in a single day. It's enough to make you appreciate modern sanitation, yet despite what we'd consider horrifying hygiene standards, Romans loved their bathhouse culture. The daily visit was a cherished social ritual, proving that when it comes to cleanliness, context is everything. Those marble-clad baths might look luxurious to us, but the reality was far more organic. Next time you hesitate at a slightly dirty gym shower, remember, at least you're not sharing a poop sponge with the entire neighborhood. Picture yourself as an average Roman citizen going about your day in the eternal city. When nature calls, you head to the public latrine, a surprisingly social space where privacy is non-existent and sanitation is questionable at best. You take your seat on the cold marble bench, one of dozens lining the walls, each with its own strategically placed hole. Around you, fellow citizens chat casually about the weather, upcoming gladiator games, or the latest political scandal, all while going about their business in what amounts to ancient Rome's most democratic institution. As you finish up, you reach for the tersorium, that infamous sponge on a stick that represents one of history's greatest public health oversights. The vinegar water it's rinsed in might kill some germs, but what the Romans didn't know about microscopic parasites would fill volumes. Medical texts from the era describe in disturbing detail the various worms that plagued Roman intestines: roundworms, tapeworms, pinworms, all thriving thanks to this well-intentioned but disastrously unhygienic system. The scene grows more horrifying when we consider the unseen consequences. That person who used the sponge before you, they might have been hosting an entire ecosystem of intestinal parasites. Now their microscopic eggs are hitching a ride on the communal cleaning tool, just waiting for their next human host, and you, dutiful citizen that you are, will unwittingly introduce them to your digestive system. Below your feet, the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, does its best to carry away the city's waste, but it's fighting a losing battle. The latrine itself is a dark, damp environment perfect for vermin. Historical accounts tell of rats and even snakes emerging from the holes to bite unsuspecting users. The decomposing waste produces methane gas that occasionally ignites, leading to stories of sudden flames erupting beneath toilet goers, ancient Rome's most embarrassing way to get injured. Even Rome's famous public baths contributed to the problem. The warm, nutrient-rich water was a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, with hundreds of bathers sharing the same water all day. The strigil-scraping ritual left piles of oily, sweaty residue that attendants had to constantly clean up. And let's not forget the wealthy women who allegedly used gladiator sweat as a beauty treatment. Though we can't verify how common this was, the fact that it was even rumoured speaks volumes about Roman attitudes toward hygiene. The irony is that the Romans thought they were being clean and civilized. The public latrines were actually an improvement over people relieving themselves in the streets, though that still happened, especially in poorer neighborhoods. The baths represented social progress compared to earlier cultures. But without understanding germ theory, they were unwittingly creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. This explains why intestinal parasites were nearly universal in Roman society, and why periodic plagues could devastate the population. The same civilization that built aqueducts and underfloor heating couldn't solve basic sanitation problems that seem obvious to us today. Their technological sophistication outpaced their medical knowledge, with unfortunate consequences for public health. So the next time you use a modern restroom, take a moment to appreciate the small miracles of plumbing, toilet paper, and most importantly, not having to share your wiping implement with the entire neighborhood. The Roman approach to sanitation serves as a stark reminder that even the most advanced civilizations can be brought low by the smallest of organisms, ones they didn't even know existed. That would definitely jolt you awake better than any cup of coffee. Because of the dangers, rich Romans often stayed far away from public toilets. Instead, they used chamber pots at home and had their slaves take care of the mess. They didn't want to share toilets with everyday people, or the bugs and rats that came with them. Poorer folks mostly used the public latrines, while the wealthy had private ones inside their homes. These private toilets were usually hooked up to a cesspit, or, in fancier homes, even a sewer line. In Pompeii, many grand houses had a toilet tucked into the kitchen, basically just a seat over a pot or a drain. It seems gross to us, having the bathroom so close to where food was made, but back then it was normal. Maybe it made dumping waste easier since it was near the trash. People didn't know about germs or cross-contamination yet, so the only concern was the smell. To help with that, they burned herbs or incense to mask the odors. Let's not forget about urine. Romans were practical and didn't waste anything, even pee. In ancient Rome, human urine was actually collected for work. Fullers, who cleaned and treated clothes like early dry cleaners, used it because it had ammonia. It helped remove grease and whiten wool togas. Special jars were placed along streets so people could pee in them. And then the liquid was gathered and sold to the fullers. Emperor Vespasian even put a tax on it, basically turning pee into profit. They poured it into vats, mixed it with water, and stomped cloth in it to clean it. Since old urine turns into ammonia, it worked pretty well as a cleaner, but you can imagine the smell. Think of the strong scent of ammonia and old pee filling the air. There's even a famous story. When Vespasian's son Titus said it was gross to make money from urine, Vespasian held up a coin and said, "Money doesn't stink." In Latin, pecunia non olet. That saying is still used today. It means money's value doesn't depend on where it came from, even if it came from pee. Romans also used urine in other ways. It helped tan leather and, believe it or not, was used as mouthwash. Yes, some Romans rinsed with aged urine to whiten their teeth. It sounds awful, but the ammonia really did help bleach teeth. In fact, they imported urine from Portugal because they thought it was stronger. Iberian urine was famous for being good at tooth cleaning. While the thought makes us gag, it worked in a way. But it definitely didn't leave you with fresh breath. Poets like Catullus joked about people having glowing smiles thanks to all that pee rinsing. And the idea didn't vanish quickly. People were still using urine in dental care even in medieval times. We see it mentioned in books from the 1500s. So the next time you gargle minty mouthwash, be thankful it's not a cup of sour human pee. Romans also had to live with bugs. Just like Egyptians and Greeks, they had lice and fleas everywhere. Archaeologists have found Roman combs with tiny teeth made to pull lice and nits from hair. Both kids and adults often had lice, and getting rid of them was a regular job. It could have been a task for moms or slaves, carefully picking lice from someone's scalp. It's pretty likely that while relaxing in public bathhouses, Romans also took time to check themselves and each other for lice, kind of like apes grooming one another, but instead of sitting in trees, they did it beside steamy marble baths. It's a funny but slightly gross picture. Two Romans chilling on the edge of a hot bath, chatting about politics while picking lice from their hair and flicking them away, or squishing them. One Roman writer, Seneca, even said that people should accept things like fleas and lice calmly, as just part of life. Bedbugs were another issue mentioned in old texts. Just like today, they were a pain to deal with. Since there were no bug sprays, people tried odd home tricks, like sprinkling ashes, or herbs in their beds, or hanging a bull's hoof charm nearby, which was believed to scare off the bugs. It probably didn't work, and most people just had to live with the bites. Still, even with all these unpleasant details, the Romans reached a level of public hygiene that Europe wouldn't see again for many centuries. Big cities had public bathhouses on nearly every corner. Imagine being able to bathe every day, even if you were poor. That's pretty impressive. They built sewer systems to carry waste away, though not always perfectly maintained. They even had workers cleaning the streets and laws to keep the city at least somewhat tidy. Romans valued fresh air, movement, and exercise as parts of a healthy life, ideas we still agree with today. But without knowing about germs and bacteria, they missed a lot of invisible dangers. Diseases could spread through shared bath water or communal sponges. And yes, many of their water pipes were made of lead, which could slowly poison people over time. They simply did the best they could with what they understood. Also, Roman attitudes about the body were different from ours. They weren't as shy about things like using the bathroom in front of others. A Roman might find it odd that we want total privacy in the toilet. To them, it could be a social place. So as you snuggle under your blanket, thankful for your clean bathroom and running water, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come and how much we learned from those messy, ancient times. But this isn't the end of our journey. Next, we'll head further east to discover how ancient China handled hygiene. Sometimes in ways very different from the West, and other times surprisingly alike. So take a deep breath, relax, and let's journey quietly along the old Silk Road to ancient China. China's long history includes clever inventions and some very unusual cleaning habits. Ancient Chinese society was full of smart ideas and strange remedies when it came to hygiene. Being one of the world's oldest cultures, China had a mix of practices, some that make perfect sense to us, and others that might seem odd today. Let's gently explore how people tried to stay clean, from royal palaces to tiny farmhouses. Cleanliness was important in traditional Chinese thinking. Ideas from Taoism, like balance and harmony, and Confucianism, with its stress on ritual purity, meant that being clean was linked to being a good person. When they could afford it, many Chinese people bathed regularly. In fact, some ancient Chinese cities had public bathhouses too, smaller than the Roman ones, but similar in idea. Hot springs were also popular for bathing. And here's something amazing. By the Tang dynasty, from the 7th to 9th centuries AD, the Chinese had already invented and were using toilet paper. Toilet paper, an invention we take for granted today, was actually created in ancient China. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let's go back a bit. In early Chinese daily life, personal care included washing the face and feet, especially after long walks on dusty roads. In some time periods, it was even polite to offer guests water to wash their feet. Common people didn't bathe every day, especially in the cold, dry north, but they likely did so weekly and more often in warmer areas. Wealthier families had wooden tubs, and their servants would heat water for baths. Herbal bath blends were common. People added things like mugwort leaves or flower petals to the water for scent and believed healing effects. Instead of soap, many used powdered rice bran or ground beans to scrub their skin clean. By the Qin and Han dynasties, around the 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD, the Chinese had developed soap-like cleansers made from plants such as soap nuts or mung beans. They also created a tool that's still part of our daily routine: the toothbrush. The earliest bristle toothbrush came from China during the Tang dynasty, 7th century AD. It had hog hair bristles fixed to bamboo or bone handles. Before this, like many cultures, people used chewing sticks from fragrant trees like willow or miswak to clean their teeth. But the Chinese were likely the first to think, let's put pig hair on a stick to make a better tooth cleaner. So if you brushed your teeth this morning, you can thank their innovation, though early bristles were rough and tough on the gums. And yes, toilet paper was their idea too. As early as the Sui dynasty in the 6th century, people were using paper for hygiene. By the Tang dynasty, a scholar even noted that he wouldn't dare use pages with wise writings for the toilet, showing plain paper was indeed used to wipe. By the 14th century, during the Yuan and Ming periods, records show that huge amounts of special toilet paper were produced for the emperor's household. So while medieval Europeans were using rags, hay, or even just their hands and water, wealthier Chinese were wiping with soft paper. Not everyone could afford it, of course. In rural areas, many still used bamboo leaves or water, but if you had money in the city, toilet paper was a very real luxury. As for sanitation, ancient Chinese cities had some drainage systems, especially in palaces. For instance, during the Zhou dynasty, royal compounds had drains to carry away wastewater, but most ordinary homes didn't have plumbing. People relied on outhouses or cesspits. One especially unique and surprisingly practical habit in ancient China was the use of human waste as fertilizer, a practice both resourceful and revolting. This waste, known politely as night soil, was collected at night or early morning by workers who went house to house, emptying chamber pots and toilets into barrels. They then hauled the smelly load out of the city to sell to farmers, who composted and used it to enrich their fields. Gross? Absolutely. But it was effective and helped boost crop growth. It was a kind of ancient recycling. There's even an old Chinese saying, "Treasure night soil as if it were gold." That tells you just how important fertilizer was for growing food. There was a downside to handling human waste, especially without gloves or modern sanitation. People risked catching diseases like cholera or parasites. Yes, the parasite problem again. But the Chinese often composted waste properly, letting it age to kill off some of the harmful pathogens before spreading it on fields. This practice, common for thousands of years and even into the 20th century in some rural areas, kept a lot of human waste out of rivers. So that part was good. What's wild is that people valued human feces enough to collect and sell it. A strange but practical dynamic. Now let's talk about the toilets themselves. In poor rural areas, a basic pit latrine or outhouse was typical, but some clever and stomach-turning farmers developed what's known as a pig toilet. This was a small outhouse built directly above a pigsty. A chute or hole would drop human waste straight into the pig's pen, where the pig would eat it, along with any kitchen scraps. Pigs, being omnivores, will eat excrement. Gross, but true. In effect, the pig acted as a living garbage disposal, turning human waste into future bacon. From a resource efficiency standpoint, it's impressive. No waste wasted. But from a hygiene perspective, deeply questionable. Parasites could pass between humans and pigs, creating a nasty disease cycle. Still, the setup was popular because it saved farmers' labor and fed the pig cheaply. No need to clean the latrine yourself, just let the pig take care of it. The smell, likely awful. Imagine a cross between an outhouse and a pig pen, but for those who lived there, it was just normal farm life. Eventually the pig would be slaughtered and eaten. There's a dark humor in that full circle cycle. People feed the pig with their poop and then eat the pig. A complete loop of gross practicality. But in times of hunger, you did what you had to do. In cities, public toilets did exist. A Chinese writer from the Eastern Han period, 1st century AD, described multi-seat latrines, some with removable buckets, others connected to sewers. During the Tang and Song dynasties, 7th to 13th centuries. Larger cities had public latrines that were cleaned regularly by those night soil collectors. Some places even had early flushing mechanisms. One archaeological find, a toilet over 2,000 years old, showed a seat with a drainage channel and water reservoir. It may have been manually flushed, likely in a wealthy home or tomb. That's a flush toilet way ahead of its time, long before anything like it became common elsewhere. But for most people, Toilets remained basic, pit latrines or chamber pots. And now we venture into the realm of the truly weird and gross, folk remedies. One particularly odd suggestion in ancient Chinese medicine was to wash your armpits with stale urine at least once a year. The idea was that urine containing ammonia could cleanse and deodorize the area. Ammonia can neutralize odors, but let's be real, you'd still smell like pee. Still, it was prescribed, and someone probably did it. Think of it as a yearly armpit detox, with pee. Urine actually played a recurring role in traditional Chinese remedies. It was applied to skin conditions, acne, even fungal infections. For earaches, there are records of warm urine being dripped directly into the ear, and yes, some people even drank it. Morning urine specifically was thought by some to have health benefits. This wasn't unique to China either. Similar ideas popped up in other ancient cultures. Still, drinking pee as a tonic. That's dedication to folk medicine. The Chinese also refined a substance known as autumn mineral, chushi, which was essentially human urine that had been processed and crystallized. It was used in medicines and believed to carry yang energy, capable of curing a range of ailments. And what about lice? In ancient China, as in many places, lice were constant companions, especially for the poor. People were so used to them that some would casually pick them off their bodies and, in a rather revolting habit, eat them. Yes, historical accounts describe people cracking lice between their teeth or swallowing them after plucking them from hair or clothing. Disgusting to us now, but back then, it might have been reflexive. Today, we'd flick a louse away or crush it in tissue. Some people simply popped it in their mouth. Maybe they were perpetually hungry and figured, hey, protein? It happened often enough that there were even folk remedies for people who got sick from eating too many lice. One medical text advised that if someone had stomach pain from this, you should give them a drink of boiled water mixed with ashes from a comb to help pass the bugs. It's almost surreal to imagine a mother scolding her child. Stop eating your lice, you'll get a stomachache. But for those in the poorest, most vermin-ridden conditions, this was just life. Meanwhile, in wealthier Chinese households, hygiene looked very different. Families washed their clothes. There was a profession of washermen and washerwomen who beat garments in rivers and used lye made from plant ash to clean them. Hair was oiled and styled using fragrant pastes. Still, even emperors weren't immune to lice or fleas. Silk robes, while luxurious, could hide entire colonies of parasites in their folds. Some emperors reportedly changed clothes several times a day, not just for fashion, but to stay ahead of the infestation. The used garments would then be boiled and laundered. One ancient text even praises a diligent palace woman for inspecting the emperor's clothing daily to check for pests. Body odor was another concern. Interestingly, genetics may have helped. A large percentage of East Asians carry a gene variant that results in drier earwax and fewer apocrine sweat glands, meaning less underarm odor. Based on modern genetics, it's possible many Chinese in ancient times didn't need heavy deodorants. Still, personal scent was taken seriously. Literature from the time mentions odor as something to manage. Wealthy individuals carried scented sachets, small pouches filled with herbs like clove, sandalwood, or camphor. These were tucked into robes or hung from belts as both perfume and protection from unpleasant smells. Court etiquette took this even further. When appearing before the emperor, courtiers were required to suck on cloves beforehand so that their breath would smell pleasant. Halitosis was not tolerated in imperial presence. Imagine scrambling to chew on cloves before an audience with the Son of Heaven. Yet not everyone bathed regularly. Some Taoist practitioners believed in minimal bathing, fearing that excessive washing could drain the body's vital energies or strip away protective oils that shielded against illness. This is somewhat similar to medieval European ideas that bathing could make the body vulnerable. In northern China's brutal winters, skipping baths was also practical. With no indoor heating, stripping down for a full wash was risky. Instead, many people got by with sponge baths, washing their hands and face and changing their underclothes. Full body baths? Sometimes not, for months. There's a story from the Tang dynasty about a scholar who proudly declared he hadn't taken a proper bath in years. It was seen as a bit eccentric even then. On the other hand, in nearby Korea, while influenced by Chinese culture, people developed their own customs. Historical records show that Koreans often bathed frequently, even daily in some cases. Some were baffled by the fact that many Chinese didn't wash as often. This regional contrast is interesting. Even within China, hygiene habits varied widely. In the warmer southern regions, people tended to wash more frequently, while in the colder northern areas, less so. Chinese traditional medicine also had some hygiene-relevant practices that, by modern standards, seem bizarre. One involved using dried feces in remedies. There were various names, but one example was fermented child feces, called golden juice, used in small doses to treat digestive issues. It sounds counterintuitive. Treat a stomachache by ingesting poop, but the logic behind it may resemble modern ideas about fecal transplants, reintroducing gut flora. It's unclear whether it helped, but it was part of the ancient pharmacopoeia. Another example was urine therapy. Human urine, even infant urine, was used in certain medical preparations, believed to have detoxifying properties. Urea from urine can have effects on skin, so there may have been some basis. Still, the thought of purposefully drinking these fluids or applying them for health reasons, that took commitment. One notable cultural practice that, while not hygiene in itself, brought huge hygiene challenges was foot binding. Beginning around the Song dynasty and continuing for centuries, young girls had their feet tightly bound to deform them into the tiny lotus foot. The result was lifelong pain and serious cleanliness issues. The toes curled under, toenails grew inward, and the flesh often broke down from lack of circulation and space. Infections were common. Feet had to be regularly unwrapped, cleaned of rotting skin, and washed to reduce odor, only to be bound again. Men of the time considered the bound feet erotic, though they almost never saw them unwrapped. The feet were always concealed in silk wrappings and ornate shoes, partly because the actual appearance was gnarled and disfigured, and partly because they often smelled of decay. It's a disturbing case of a beauty practice leading to chronic hygiene problems. Many women had to rely on their husbands or servants to gently wash the wounds and soak the feet in special herbal solutions to reduce the stench and infection. While foot binding wasn't general hygiene, it was definitely a realm where cleanliness was extremely hard to maintain because of deliberate deformity. In sum, the ancient Chinese hygiene experience was a fascinating blend of surprisingly modern concepts like toothbrushes, toilet paper, regular bathing for some, and public sanitation services, with traditional or bizarre practices like using urine for cleansing, eating lice, pig toilets, and medicinal poop. China's long cultural continuity allowed knowledge to build over generations. By the medieval period, cities in China were often ahead of the world in public health. Travelers from Europe in the 13th century, like Marco Polo, remarked that cities such as Kanbalik, Beijing, were relatively clean. He noted that street sweepers kept the roads tidy, and that compared to Europeans at the time, the Chinese bathed more frequently. However, it's important to note that China was not immune to plagues and outbreaks. Diseases still struck, especially in crowded urban centers and poorer quarters, where waste management wasn't always ideal. As we begin to drift beyond China, marveling slightly at human resilience and creativity, we're reminded that every culture, regardless of wealth or wisdom, has faced the same age-old challenges of dirt, sweat, pests, and waste. Across time and place, people tried everything from the sensible to the downright strange in their quest to stay clean or healthy. And now, we begin a quiet transition to another era, famously lacking in cleanliness. Medieval Europe. Prepare for a slow and sleepy stroll through muddy alleyways and damp stone castles, a world lit by flickering tallow candles and perfumed by, let's say, less than pleasant aromas. Don't worry. We'll keep the tone gentle, like a bedtime story set in a world of grime. Medieval Europe. A time so often romanticized with images of knights, noble ladies, castles, and troubadours. But if we were to visit a typical European town in, say, the 12th or 14th century, our first instinct might be to hold our noses. Personal and public hygiene by today's standards was rather dreadful. Not everywhere, and not at every moment. There were bright spots and some progress, but in general, from the 5th to the 15th centuries, Europe was known for its filth and stench. This doesn't mean people wanted to be dirty. Far from it. More often they simply didn't have the means, infrastructure, or accurate medical knowledge to do much better. So let's take a calm walk through a typical day in medieval Europe, observing how people dealt with the realities of bodily needs and cleanliness, gently, matter-of-factly, with no judgment. Bathing, for instance, wasn't completely foreign. Contrary to popular belief, in the early medieval period, public bathhouses were still in use. These were inherited from the Romans and were also influenced by Islamic culture, which valued regular bathing. In 13th century cities like Paris or London, bathhouses still existed, known as stews in England. But gradually, a mix of factors led to their decline. The church began to warn against bathhouses, associating them with immoral behavior, especially as they sometimes turned into mixed-gender spaces or covert brothels. Medical ideas also shifted. There was a growing belief that frequent bathing could weaken the body, or that hot water opened the pores to disease. After the Black Death in the 14th century, many Europeans began to fear that water itself might carry contagion. So by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, bathing had become much less common. Far fewer people took full baths than in Roman times or in some other ancient cultures. For most, cleanliness meant the occasional sponge bath, wiping the body with a damp cloth, or cleaning just the hands, face, and feet. There was also the concept of a dry wash, where people rubbed themselves with clean linen, changed underclothes frequently, or used powders to absorb sweat and oil without touching water. A full immersion bath was rare and often reserved for the wealthy. Heating enough water to fill a big tub in a cold, drafty house wasn't easy, and it could even be dangerous if fire got out of hand. So, only the rich could manage a bath now and then. A nobleman might have a tub carried to his room, and servants would pour in hot water. But even then, he might only bathe once a month, or just a few times a year. Queen Elizabeth I of England, in the late 1500s, once said she took a bath every month, whether I need it or not. And that was considered frequent. There's even a famous, though probably exaggerated story about Queen Isabella of Castile, from Spain in the late 1400s, who supposedly claimed she only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. Whether true or not, people back then sometimes saw not bathing as a sign of being holy or tough. Oddly enough, staying too clean was viewed with suspicion. Some feared that washing too much could strip away modesty or even spiritual protection. Plus, regular baths reminded people of the Roman Empire or the Moors in Spain, both seen as too worldly or pagan. So some Christians avoided bathing just to set themselves apart. So what did people do instead of bathing? They changed their clothes, especially their underclothes. If you could afford it, you'd wear clean linen shirts or shifts often. Linen was great at soaking up sweat and oils from the skin. The idea was that dirt would stick to the linen, which you or your servants would then wash, maybe once a week. Advice books of the time suggested wearing a fresh nightshirt to bed and letting your daytime clothes air out in the sun. So cleanliness was mostly about washing your clothes, not your body. But of course, that only worked up to a point. If you never washed yourself, all that grime added up. People just got used to the smell. Body odor was normal. Unless someone really stank, no one made a fuss. People did use perfumes and scents, though. Women might carry little bouquets of herbs or flowers, called posies, to sniff when passing through bad smells. This trick is often linked to the plague. In fact, the pocketful of posies in the nursery rhyme refers to these herb bundles, meant to block out foul air. And medieval cities smelled terrible. With no proper sewers, human and animal waste piled up, people would throw the contents of chamber pots into the street. If you lived upstairs, you'd lean out the window, shout a warning, and toss it down. In French, they'd call garde l'eau or watch out for the water, which some say turned into the English phrase gardez-l'eau. Pedestrians knew to dodge fast, hopefully in time. Streets usually had gutters in the middle to carry off waste when it rained, but when it was dry it just sat there. Add in all the animals, horses, pigs, chickens, leaving droppings everywhere, and things got messy fast. Rotting food was tossed out too, often eaten by stray dogs or pigs. So walking down a medieval street wasn't just smelly, it was a full-on sensory nightmare. Some cities hired people to sweep up the worst of it, and laws were made to keep streets clean. But these rules weren't always followed. In the 1300s London, they even complained that some streets were so full of human and animal filth, people couldn't walk through them. In medieval cities like London and Paris, the rivers often served as open sewers. Many houses had latrines or drains that emptied directly into the river. Unsurprisingly, people avoided drinking from these waters. Instead, they fetched water from wells or springs outside the city. Water from rivers was often too dirty to trust. Though they didn't know about germs, they understood that bad water could make you sick. That's why many people drank ale or wine. Fermentation helped kill off some harmful things, making these drinks safer than water. Toilets in castles or manors were very basic. There were small rooms called garderobes, just a seat over a hole in the wall. Waste dropped straight down, sometimes into a pit, or worse, into the castle's moat. That meant some moats became smelly sewage ponds. Not every moat was like this, but some definitely were fouled by waste. In humbler homes, people used chamber pots, which they emptied into the yard or stable, and someone had to clean out the pits and cesspools under towns and castles. That was the job of the gong farmer in England. These workers cleaned up the human waste, or night soil, from cesspits. It was dirty, dangerous work. They usually worked at night because of the terrible smell and to stay out of sight. They would scoop out waste and carry it outside town, sometimes selling it to farmers for use as fertilizer, just like people did in ancient China. The job wasn't just gross, it was risky. Gong farmers could pass out from the fumes or even die from toxic gases in deep pits. To be safe, some carried torches into the pits, hoping the flame would burn off any built-up methane gas. Lighting a fire in a pit full of poop sounds wild, but it could prevent explosions or suffocation. Because the job was so awful, they were actually paid quite well, more than a regular labourer. but they lived with the stink and social shame. Some towns even made them live away from others and only work after dark so they wouldn't upset people's noses. Then there were the pests. Medieval Europe was full of them. Fleas and rats were everywhere, and they helped spread the Black Death in the 1340s. Houses, even rich ones, weren't clean by modern standards. Floors were often covered in rushes, straw-like plants, and instead of cleaning them out, people just threw new ones on top. Hidden under these layers were bits of rotting food, vomit, pet messes, and spilled drink. All of it made a perfect home for fleas and lice. Wealthy families sometimes added herbs or flowers to the rushes to help cover the smell, but unless they fully replaced the floor coverings and scrubbed underneath, which only happened a few times a year at best, things stayed filthy. Beds weren't safe either. Bed bugs and lice were common. People tried to fight them with strong-smelling substances like brimstone or vinegar, but these didn't always work. Lice were so widespread that nitpicking, literally picking out lice eggs, became a normal activity. Women would often sit together in the sun, going through a child's or friend's hair, cracking lice with their fingernails. It was oddly social and even relaxing. Special combs with very fine teeth were used to help remove lice. Since full baths were rare and washing clothes in hot water was difficult, lice stayed with people constantly. Itching must have just felt like part of daily life. Some people in the Middle Ages shaved their heads to cut down on lice, especially under hats or wigs. Men in the Middle Ages often kept their hair short, while women usually wore veils or hats, possibly to hide hair that wasn't exactly clean. Hair care wasn't a priority for most, and neither was dental hygiene. People didn't brush their teeth like we do today. Instead, they might rub them with a cloth, use a toothpick made from wood or a bird quill, or rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar. There was no toothpaste, though some wealthier folks had homemade tooth powders made from things like salt, herbs, or charcoal. Tooth problems were common. By middle age, many people had already lost teeth or had painful abscesses. Bad breath was so normal that people probably only noticed if someone's breath was especially awful. Those who could afford it might chew herbs like parsley or mint before social gatherings to freshen up. Interestingly, sugar wasn't widely available in Europe until the later Middle Ages, so early on, tooth decay wasn't as extreme, but coarse bread and poor cleaning still wore down teeth and caused infections. The only fix? Yanking the tooth out, done by a barber or a travelling tooth puller. No painkillers unless you count getting drunk first. Despite all this, people did care about being clean, at least somewhat. There are records from the time showing that hand-washing was a common custom, especially before and after meals. At the table, people ate mostly with their hands, so clean fingers mattered. Guests might be offered a bowl and jug of warm water and a towel to wash up, a small ritual that helped keep grease and grime at bay. In the mornings, many would splash their face and rinse their hands. So no, they didn't completely avoid water, just full-body baths were rare. In the warmer months, it wasn't unusual for ordinary folks to bathe or swim in rivers to cool off and clean up, but in colder climates they simply layered on clothes and waited for spring. As for clothing hygiene, undergarments and linens were washed more often than outer clothes. Washerwomen did laundry in rivers or big tubs using lye soap made from ash and animal fat. It was rough on skin and fabric and didn't smell great, but it worked. Heavy woolen coats or fancy clothes were rarely washed. Instead, people aired them out or brushed them off. Over time, these layers absorbed smoke from the hearth, sweat, and all sorts of odours. The hope was that clean linen underneath would catch most of the sweat, and that part at least got washed regularly. Now let's talk about something particularly unpleasant, medieval disease and how people dealt with it. There was no understanding of sterilization or germs. If someone got a cut or wound, It might be rinsed with water or wine, which could help, but many remedies were downright horrifying. Some balms were made using things like animal dung or human spit. Yes, really, folk medicine included all sorts of bizarre ingredients. One recipe for a sore throat involved cooking a swallow the bird, mixing it with human feces, and applying it as a paste. Another used fresh pig dung to treat nosebleeds, because people believed its cold, moist qualities would help stop the bleeding. These may sound disgusting today, but back then people were desperate. During plagues like the Black Death, some even sat in latrines or smoke-filled rooms, thinking the bad smells might drive away the disease. They believed plague was caused by bad air, so other strong odors might cancel it out. Of course, none of these methods worked. After several deadly waves of plague, some cities slowly began making changes. Town officials started clearing waste more regularly and working to improve access to clean water. But change came slowly, and for most medieval people, life remained messy, smelly, and tough. By the late Middle Ages, some towns, especially in the Low Countries like Holland, were surprisingly clean by comparison. They had street gutters, and it was often required that each resident keep the area in front of their home swept. These were early signs of urban sanitation practices emerging. Interestingly, Southern Europe, despite inheriting the legacy of Roman baths, saw a decline in public bathing during the medieval Christian era. The exception? Islamic Spain and Sicily. There, under Muslim influence, the tradition of bathing lived on. In contrast to much of medieval Europe, the Muslim world placed a high value on cleanliness. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and later Istanbul, public bathhouses were everywhere, and people bathed frequently as part of religious rituals and daily life. They even used high-quality soap, often made from olive oil. For European crusaders visiting the Holy Land in the 12th century, the contrast must have been staggering. They would have seen locals bathing daily, surrounded by fragrant steam and luxurious soaps. It's often said that crusaders brought soap knowledge back to Europe with them. By the 13th century, soap-making guilds had sprung up, perhaps drawing from Islamic recipes. But the idea of regular bathing spread slowly among the general population. So, when we picture medieval Europe, we're looking at a world far more familiar with dirt and strong smells than we are today. People lived close to their waste, their animals, and each other, and they coped with it. Fragrances, polite customs like hand-washing before meals, and the occasional bath helped, but the day-to-day reality was pungent. If we were to time travel back, we'd likely be overwhelmed by the smell. But to them, it was simply normal. The human nose adapts. Perhaps they would find our world strange, too clean, too sterile, filled with sharp, artificial scents. It's a curious thought. So as you lie there now, maybe feeling a little uneasy after imagining all that medieval filth, take comfort. You can shower, use scented soap, and flush your toilet with the push of a lever. These are small modern miracles that a person in the Middle Ages could barely dream of, if they could even imagine such things at all. Before we conclude our sleepy journey, let's take a gentle peek beyond medieval Europe to see how hygiene looked in other cultures and eras. Some were surprisingly advanced, some had odd quirks, and yes, some were downright unpleasant. This is just a light touch, like flipping through an old picture book of the world, slowly and quietly. Take the Indus Valley Civilization, around 2500 BC in what's now Pakistan and India. They were remarkably ahead of their time. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, homes were often built with private drains that carried wastewater out to covered street-side sewers, a planned sewage system in the Bronze Age. Quite amazing. An incredible innovation for the Bronze Age, the Indus Valley civilization had early toilets, essentially brick platforms with a hole leading through a clay pipe to a sewer or soak pit. These were often paired with poured water for flushing, suggesting something like a simple sit-down or squat toilet. Pottery bathtubs have also been found. Large, tub-shaped vessels placed in homes that may have been used for bathing. One of the most remarkable finds is the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a large public pool, carefully constructed with watertight brickwork and drains. It suggests that cleanliness, perhaps for spiritual reasons, was culturally significant. Alongside this, they produced large amounts of pottery, some likely used to store water or perhaps serve as chamber pots. Compared to other civilizations of the time, the Indus cities stand out for their thoughtful urban planning and commitment to managing waste. Of course, their systems weren't modern, and they didn't have flush toilets or sanitation treatment, but to imagine those brick-lined drains covered by stone slabs, quietly channeling wastewater away from homes, is impressive. After this civilization declined, large-scale urban hygiene in the region faded until much later. Yet ritual bathing remained central in Indian culture. Rivers like the Ganges became symbolic of spiritual purity, and regular bathing, even if the water wasn't always clean, was and still is a meaningful part of daily life. Many people poured water over themselves each morning from wells or rivers, a habit worlds apart from medieval Europe's sporadic washing. Turning to the Islamic Middle East during the 7th to 15th centuries, cleanliness was not just a cultural preference, it was religiously guided. The Quran and the Hadiths offered detailed hygiene instructions: wash hands, face, and feet before each prayer in a ritual called wudu, and perform a full-body bath, ghusl, after certain events. This emphasis made personal cleanliness a part of everyday life. As a result, public bathhouses, or hammams, were a central feature in Muslim cities. These establishments were often ornate, with steam rooms, hot and cold pools, and spaces for scrubbing and massage. Weekly, or even more frequent visits were common. A traveller in the 12th century described Damascus as having numerous public baths and noted that even rural villagers made the journey to town for a proper wash. Soap, too, flourished. By the 8th century, Middle Eastern soap makers were producing hard bar soap, the ancestor of today's Castile soap, using olive oil, lime, and alkali. Crusaders encountering these hygiene practices may have returned with both soap and the knowledge of how to make it. One legend even tells of a sultan sending soap as a gift to a European king, a gesture underscoring its value. Islamic hygiene went beyond bathing. Cleanliness was a religious virtue. Men were encouraged to trim their moustaches, clean their teeth with miswak twigs, natural toothbrushes, and shave pubic and underarm hair for cleanliness. This meant many medieval Muslim individuals were likely more groomed and fresher smelling than their European contemporaries. Ironically, some Europeans mocked the perfumed Saracens, not realizing that those scents adorned clean, freshly washed skin, whereas European perfumes were often battling layers of accumulated odor. In the Mongol Empire of the 13th century, however, we find a fascinating contrast. The Mongols had a spiritual aversion to washing in rivers, believing it could offend the spirits of water. As a result, they often avoided bathing in natural water sources, especially during certain times. This didn't mean they were entirely unclean. Some used dry cleaning methods like rubbing with cloths or perfumed pastes, but their hygiene habits were shaped by deeply held animistic beliefs. Among the Mongols, the scarcity of water on the open steppes meant bathing was not a common luxury. Instead, they found creative substitutes. Sweat tents, akin to makeshift saunas, were used, where hot stones created steam in an enclosed space. People would sweat, then rub their skin with cloth or animal fat to remove grime. It's even said that being a little dirty on campaign might protect one from evil spirits. Perhaps more a bit of folklore than fact, but it reflects their deep-rooted spiritual beliefs. Other hygiene practices included smoke baths, where individuals would stand over aromatic smoke to absorb the scent and help mask body odor. Some also used scented pastes, or simply adjusted to being unwashed longer. But hygiene wasn't neglected entirely. Mongols had rules for sanitation. Waste was to be deposited away from camps, and their clothing choices were strategic. Silk underclothes were popular, not just for comfort, but because lice and their eggs struggled to cling to the slick fabric. This helped reduce infestations, a practical and rather clever solution. There's an account, perhaps exaggerated, that some Mongols wore their clothes until they disintegrated. True or not, it illustrates how different their concept of cleanliness was from that of urban societies. In sub-Saharan Africa, hygiene habits were as diverse as the cultures themselves. In West Africa, where rivers were abundant and the climate hot, regular bathing in natural waters was common. People also made traditional soaps from ingredients like palm oil, shea butter, and ash, precursors to what we now call African black soap, a gentle yet effective cleanser still widely used today. In ancient Ethiopia, herbal steam baths were used not only for cleanliness but for health. Much like in other ancient civilizations, in the drier regions, such as where the San Bushmen lived, water was precious. There, people relied on ash or clay to cleanse the skin, absorbing oil and odor, much like dry shampoo. Some desert communities even used sand for abrasive scrubbing. These resourceful adaptations allowed cleanliness without water, a remarkable feat of environmental adaptation. Another interesting practice. In many African homes, floors and walls were plastered with a mixture of mud and cow dung. While it may sound unpleasant, dried dung doesn't smell. Instead, it creates a hard, cleanable surface that naturally repels insects. These homes, replastered regularly, could be surprisingly clean and cool inside. What seems gross at first glance was actually a very practical form of home hygiene. On the American continents, indigenous cultures developed equally thoughtful hygiene practices. Across North America, many native tribes used sweat lodges, small enclosed huts with heated stones. Water would be poured over the stones to create steam, opening pores and flushing out dirt. These sweat baths were deeply spiritual, but had the side benefit of cleansing the body thoroughly. Afterward, bathers might plunge into a stream or roll in snow, a bracing but refreshing rinse. The Maya and Aztecs in Central America had temazcals, dome-shaped stone sweat houses, sometimes located next to homes or temples. These weren't occasional luxuries. They were used regularly, often daily. The Aztecs in particular are noted for their fondness for cleanliness. They reportedly bathed frequently, and not just in steam. They used cold water and natural soaps made from plants like amole. Combined with clean clothes and the burning of incense to freshen spaces, their approach to hygiene would have felt surprisingly modern to us. And so, around the world, from smoky tents on the Mongolian steppe, to clay-plastered homes in Africa, to fragrant steam huts in Mesoamerica, humans have always sought ways to clean and care for their bodies, even if the methods seem odd or earthy by modern standards. Throughout history, humans have found creative, surprising, and sometimes downright strange ways to stay clean. In the Bronze Age, the Indus Valley civilization stood out for its advanced urban hygiene. Early homes in cities like Mohenjo-Daro featured brick platforms with holes leading via clay pipes to soak pits or sewers, precursors to squat or sit-down toilets. Some homes even had pottery bathtubs, the Great Bath, a large public pool, illustrates the cultural significance of ritual bathing. Pottery vessels may have served as water containers or chamber pots, showing a clear commitment to hygiene uncommon for the time. Their brick-lined, slab-covered drains were remarkably sophisticated, and although they lacked modern waste treatment, their cities were likely more pleasant and cleaner than others of their era. Following the Indus Valley's decline, urban sanitation in the Indian subcontinent saw a setback. Still, ritual bathing persisted through Hindu practices. Rivers like the Ganges became spiritual purification sites. Even if the water wasn't sanitary, the habit of daily washing helped maintain personal cleanliness, contrasting starkly with medieval Europe, where bathing was rare. In the medieval Islamic world, 7th to 15th centuries, hygiene was deeply embedded in religious practice. The Quran and Hadiths encouraged ritual washing, ablutions before prayer, wudu, and full-body cleansing in specific situations. Public bathhouses, or hammams, became widespread across cities. These establishments resembled Roman baths, complete with steam rooms and cold pools. People visited them weekly or more for both cleanliness and relaxation. Soap-making advanced, too. Hard bar soaps were crafted from olive oil, lime and alkali by the 8th century, an early version of today's Castile soap. Cleanliness was emphasized further by grooming traditions like trimming facial hair, using the miswak twig for dental care, and removing body hair. Muslim individuals likely smelled far better than their Christian counterparts, even as Europeans scoffed at the perfumed Saracens without realizing their hygiene was superior. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire had a very different relationship with cleanliness. Superstitions about polluting sacred rivers discouraged bathing in running water. Instead, they cleansed themselves with animal fat or through sweat baths in tents, makeshift saunas. They might have used aromatic smoke baths or developed a tolerance for limited washing. Despite appearances, hygiene wasn't ignored. Rules dictated waste disposal far from camps. Silk undergarments helped repel lice, and while some claims about never washing clothes may be exaggerated, it's clear that nomadic cleanliness looked different from urban standards. In sub-Saharan Africa, hygiene practices varied greatly. West Africans often bathed in rivers, aided by natural soaps made from shea butter, palm oil and ash, roots of the modern African black soap. Now let's dive into Wild West stench. The Wild West, known for its rugged landscapes and daring adventures, is often romanticized as a thrilling time in American history. But behind the stories of outlaws and frontier life, daily living was far from glamorous. Unlike today, where cleanliness is easily attainable, the pioneers of the Wild West faced a harsh existence, struggling to maintain hygiene in a dusty, untamed world with few of the comforts we now take for granted. Life back then was a constant battle against dirt and disease. The streets of the Wild West weren't just paths, they were hazards. Across the western frontier, these roads were often filled with horse manure, discarded waste, and thick mud that could swallow your boots whole. Horse-drawn wagons were the main mode of transport, and their droppings were left to rot, adding to the heavy stench in the air. With no organized waste removal system, settlers would often throw their garbage right into the streets. The mix of trash and manure created a perfect breeding ground for disease. This grim reality was common in nearly every frontier town, and it wasn't just unpleasant, it was downright dangerous. The lawless nature of these towns made things worse. Regular brawls spilled out of saloons, and blood, or even bodies, were sometimes left in the streets. After infamous events like the gunfight at the OK Corral, it wasn't unusual for corpses to lie untouched until someone finally dragged them away. The streets were a grim reminder of the daily violence in these wild towns. And beyond the visible mess, the smell was something else entirely. Without proper sewage systems, human waste often ended up in the streets as well. People used outhouses when they could, but many simply dumped their waste directly onto the road. The result? A stench so foul that visitors frequently commented on it. One traveller even described the smell in Deadwood as a hellish stench caused by the mix of human and animal waste. This kind of filth made outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid fever tragically common. Illnesses that might have been minor in a cleaner environment turned into deadly epidemics in these unsanitary towns. Efforts to clean up were minimal at best. Some towns tried to pass ordinances requiring residents to clean in front of their homes, but with no real enforcement, these rules were largely ignored. It wasn't until much later, when larger cities began to develop structured waste removal systems, that some relief came. But by then, the damage was done, and the streets of the Wild West had already earned their dirty reputation. In the Wild West, many beds were far from the comfortable, plush mattresses we know today. The most common bed was a simple wooden frame, often crudely built, with a mattress stuffed with straw, hay, or feathers. While these materials offered some basic comfort, they also attracted all kinds of pests. Straw mattresses in particular were notorious for harboring bedbugs, lice, and fleas. These tiny creatures burrowed deep into the bedding, turning rest into a nightly ordeal. The wooden bed frames didn't help. Rough and unfinished, they were filled with cracks and crevices, perfect hiding spots for bedbugs. At night, these pests would emerge, feeding on whoever was unfortunate enough to sleep there and leaving behind itchy bites that made restful sleep nearly impossible. The situation was worsened by the fact that these beds were rarely cleaned. In many households, the bedding wasn't washed for weeks or even months, allowing infestations to thrive. In boarding houses, inns, and saloons where travelers frequently stayed, things got even worse. Beds were often shared by multiple guests over time, each potentially bringing in new pests. This constant turnover meant that bed bugs and lice could spread rapidly, turning shared bedding into hives of infestation. As the straw in the mattresses broke down and compacted over time, the beds became even less comfortable and even more welcoming to bugs. Some settlers tried to fight the problem. They might smoke out pests by burning sulfur or herbs near the bed, or scrub the frames with harsh lye soap if they had enough water, but these efforts were rarely enough. Successful sanitation was nearly impossible without modern cleaning supplies or effective pesticides. Most people simply had to endure the bites and discomfort night after night. In some cases, entire mattresses would need to be burned and replaced, but this was a costly and time-consuming process that many simply couldn't afford. Using an outhouse in the Wild West was far from a pleasant experience. These primitive structures, often nothing more than a small wooden shack with a hole dug beneath, were a necessary evil for many pioneers. In the late 1800s, indoor plumbing was a rare luxury, so outhouses became the go-to solution for answering nature's call. A typical outhouse was a cramped little shed, usually located a fair distance from the main home to keep the unpleasant odors at bay. They were built with whatever materials settlers had on hand, often rough-hewn wood that offered little protection from the elements. Floors were usually dirt, and the seats were nothing more than wooden planks with holes cut into them. Outhouses were built over pits that ranged from a few to several feet deep. Waste would accumulate in these pits until they were either full or unbearably smelly. At that point, someone had to take on the dreaded task of emptying it. This usually meant digging a new pit nearby and moving the entire outhouse over it, leaving the old one to decompose naturally. Some pioneers simply filled the pit with dirt and abandoned it altogether. Privacy in these outhouses was minimal. Many featured crescent moon or star-shaped cutouts on the doors. While often romanticized today, these shapes served practical purposes, providing light and ventilation and signaling occupancy. The crescent moon typically marked a women's outhouse, while a star was used for men. But using an outhouse wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The pit below was a breeding ground for disease, attracting flies and other pests that could easily spread harmful bacteria. Outhouses were often a contributing factor to outbreaks of deadly diseases like cholera and typhoid fever, which thrived in such unsanitary conditions. The odor alone could make someone feel sick, but the real danger lay in the unseen pathogens lurking below. During harsh winters, using an outhouse became even more of a challenge. With temperatures often dropping below freezing, these wooden structures offered little protection from the cold. Still, people had no choice but to brave the elements. Some households used chamber pots indoors during the coldest months to avoid the freezing trip outside, but that brought its own problems, mainly what to do with the waste afterward. The design of outhouses varied depending on region and resources. In some areas, wealthier settlers might construct slightly larger or sturdier versions. Others made do with whatever scraps they could find, but regardless of how well it was built, one fact remained: outhouses were far from hygienic. In the Wild West, the lack of toilet paper was a daily challenge settlers had to face with a mix of creativity and resilience. Toilet paper as we know it didn't become widely available until the late 1800s, and even then, it was a luxury that many frontier families couldn't afford or access. So what did people use instead? The answer lay in the rough and ready nature of life on the frontier. One of the most common alternatives was the corn cob. Yes, once the kernels were removed, the cob was surprisingly effective. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was plentiful and reusable, making it a practical, if unpleasant, solution. Another popular option was old newspapers, catalogues, or even pages from books. The Sears Roebuck catalogue, first published in 1888, became a staple in many outhouses, not just for shopping, but for hygiene. Glossy pages were torn out and used when needed. It may sound strange today, but in an era where nothing was wasted, anything with a second use was valuable. Leaves were also used, especially the broad, soft ones from plants like mullein. Known for its fuzzy texture, mullein earned the nickname cowboy toilet paper. However, choosing the wrong leaf, like poison ivy, could turn a quick bathroom trip into a painful disaster. For settlers living near water, moss provided another option. Soft and absorbent, moss was considered a more comfortable alternative. Unfortunately, it wasn't always available, especially in the drier, dusty regions of the West. In truly desperate moments, some people resorted to using cloth rags. These would be washed and reused, which wasn't ideal, but sometimes there was simply no other choice. Dental care in the Wild West was more of a horror story than a healthcare practice. With a lack of modern dental tools, professional knowledge, and proper hygiene habits, keeping your teeth in decent shape was a challenge that most pioneers simply couldn't meet. The idea of brushing your teeth daily was far from common. Without access to toothbrushes or toothpaste, settlers had to rely on rudimentary methods to care for their teeth, or more often than not, neglect them entirely. People often used a rag dipped in salt or baking soda to scrub their teeth. Baking soda, though abrasive, was somewhat effective at removing surface stains, but it did little to prevent plaque buildup or treat cavities. Salt was more commonly used for its antiseptic properties. Some settlers would mix it with water to create a simple mouthwash, hoping it might prevent infections. But these methods were far from perfect, and as a result, most people's teeth suffered badly. Toothbrushes, when they were available, were often handmade with bristles made from animal hair. These were rare and typically only found in the homes of wealthier settlers. The majority of people didn't have access to such tools and had to make do with what they could find. Some used chewed sticks, similar to ancient dental practices, to clean their teeth. These were often taken from trees like birch or willow and frayed at one end to form a makeshift brush. When it came to dental emergencies, the options were grim. Toothaches were incredibly common due to poor hygiene, and settlers often turned to whiskey or herbal remedies just to numb the pain. But if the ache became too severe to bear, there was only one real solution: extraction. Tooth extraction in the Wild West was a brutal affair. Barbers frequently doubled as dentists, and their tools were crude at best. There was no anesthesia, just a strong drink and a lot of courage. Patients would often be handed a stiff glass of whiskey, then have their tooth yanked out with pliers or other makeshift tools. It was a process so painful and terrifying that many people chose to endure the agony of a decaying tooth for as long as they could before finally giving in. Some towns were lucky enough to receive visits from traveling dentists. These roving professionals brought with them slightly better tools and a bit more knowledge. They could sometimes perform more advanced procedures like drilling and filling cavities. But these visits were rare, and their services came at a high price, one that most settlers simply couldn't afford. The poor state of dental care in the Wild West contributed to a host of other health problems. Infections from untreated cavities could easily spread to other parts of the body, leading to serious complications or even death. Without antibiotics or proper care, even something as seemingly small as a toothache could become a life-threatening condition. Now, let's talk about how women have dealt with periods throughout history. Menstruation is a natural process where the body sheds the uterine lining each month as part of the reproductive cycle. Despite its normalcy, it has long been surrounded by mystery, embarrassment, and taboo. Let's take a journey through time to explore how different cultures have understood and managed menstruation. The word menstruation comes from Latin and Greek roots, meaning month and moon. This connection exists because most menstrual cycles last about 28 to 29 days, similar to the moon's 29.5-day orbit around the Earth. Many ancient societies believed there was a direct link between the phases of the moon and a woman's menstrual cycle. As a result, mythology across the world often depicts the moon as a goddess with power over fertility. Examples include the Greek goddess Selene, the Roman Luna, Abuk of the Dinka in South Sudan, Mayumwo in Korean mythology, Lona in Hawaiian tradition, Metzli among the Aztecs, and Mama Killa of the Inca. In ancient Mayan belief, menstruation was seen as a punishment for the moon goddess having an affair with the sun god. Her blood was said to be collected in 13 jars and transformed into creatures like snakes, insects, as well as poisons and diseases. In parts of ancient North and South America, men feared that if menstruation wasn't carefully observed and synchronized, it could lead to cosmic disorder. However, modern studies have found no consistent link between menstruation and the lunar cycle, nor evidence that women living together naturally synchronize their periods. Historically, women often experienced fewer and lighter periods than women today. In pre-industrial societies, poor nutrition and frequent illnesses delayed the onset of menstruation and brought on menopause earlier. Without effective birth control, women also spent more of their reproductive years pregnant or breastfeeding, further reducing the number of periods they had. When it comes to the history of birth control and pregnancy, women in the past experienced a very different reproductive reality. On average, A woman today in a developed nation can expect to have about 450 periods in her lifetime. In contrast, women throughout most of history had around 150 periods, only a third as many. This difference is largely due to more frequent pregnancies, extended periods of breastfeeding, later onset of menstruation, and earlier menopause caused by malnutrition and illness. Throughout history, women have used whatever was available and absorbent to manage menstruation. The Ebers Papyrus, the oldest known medical text dating to the 15th century BCE, describes how women in ancient Egypt made tampons from soft rolls of papyrus. Interestingly, Egyptians also believed menstrual blood had cosmetic value. It was thought to firm sagging skin and breasts. Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, wrote about women making tampons from lint or lamb's wool, sometimes wrapped around small pieces of lightweight wood. Sea sponges were also used in the ancient Mediterranean world. In Japan, where paper was invented in 105 AD and introduced in the 6th century, women rolled paper into tampons and held them in place with cloth bandages. In Hawaii, women used the soft, furry fronds of the native hapu fern. In Indonesia, vegetable fibers were employed. Women in equatorial Africa used rolled-up grass, while Native American women crafted pads from moss and buffalo skin. Among the Cherokee, menstrual blood was considered a powerful source of feminine strength, so strong it was believed to have the power to destroy enemies. Ancient Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder described a wide array of superstitions surrounding menstruation. He claimed that a naked menstruating woman could drive pests off crops simply by walking through the fields, and could even ward off hailstorms, whirlwinds, and lightning. According to him, her touch could blacken linen, dull metal tools, and sour wine. The mathematician and astronomer Hypatia of Alexandria famously used menstruation to make a point. When a male student kept pursuing her romantically despite her clear disinterest, she threw her bloody menstrual cloth at him and declared, "This is what you really love, my young man, but you do not love beauty for its own sake." The gesture shocked him so much that he finally left her alone. In many cultures, menstruation has been used as a justification to marginalize women. In the Hebrew Torah, a menstruating woman is referred to as niddah and is considered ritually unclean. Anything she touches becomes contaminated, and if her husband touches her, he is also considered unclean until sundown. Sexual relations are forbidden during menstruation and for a week afterward, until the woman immerses herself in a ritual bath called a mikvah. Orthodox Jewish communities still follow these customs, though most other Jewish groups have relaxed or discarded them. Hindu husbands were also traditionally advised not to touch their wives during menstruation. It was believed that sex during this time might result in the birth of evil-minded or villainous offspring. Even today, in many traditional and rural households, menstruating women are expected to isolate themselves in a single room. During this time, they often miss school and work. After 3 days, they take a ritual bath known as ritusnana, after which they are encouraged to have sex with their husbands to help ensure conception. In early Christianity, similar taboos existed. In the 3rd century, Pope Dionysius of Alexandria wrote that pious women would never dare approach the holy table while menstruating. To this day, many women in the Coptic, Russian, and Greek Orthodox churches refrain from taking communion or attending church services while on their periods. But not every tradition viewed menstruation as a curse. Guru Nanak, the 15th century founder of Sikhism, condemned the idea that women were impure during menstruation. He taught that the menstrual cycle is a natural, God-given process required for the creation of human life. Buddhism takes a similarly respectful view. Although menstruating women may choose not to bow during prayers for their own comfort, there are no religious prohibitions against them participating. In modern fiction, Anita Diamant's best-selling novel The Red Tent popularized the idea that women in biblical times gathered together during menstruation and childbirth in a separate tent. There, they bonded, consoled each other, and performed private rituals. While this practice would have been a practical way to avoid contaminating the rest of the village, according to ancient purity laws, there's no solid historical evidence that menstrual tents were part of everyday life in the biblical era. Still, Diamant didn't invent the idea out of nothing. Across cultures, women have historically turned menstrual taboos to their advantage. In some societies, menstruating women used the time to go on strike, from sex, housework, and domestic responsibilities. They would retreat to menstrual huts, tents, or houses separate from men to relax and commune with other women. For example, among the native Yuchi people of California, when a woman was on her moon time, she would abstain from cooking or doing chores for 10 days. At the height of her spiritual power, she was considered too important to be burdened with mundane tasks, distractions, or thoughts of the opposite sex. Instead, she would channel her energy into meditation and ritual. She and other women would retreat to a sacred mountain hut, where they bathed and performed rituals together in a special moontime pond. It was said that all the women in the community menstruated at the same time. If one woman's cycle fell out of sync, she could pray to the moon to restore her balance. Among the Kalasha people in northwestern Pakistan, a similar tradition continues. They call their communal menstrual house. The most sacred place in their village, the largest building at its center, is always filled with women. They gather there to gossip, laugh, sing, share advice, and even give birth. Women bring their babies and young children along, but this space, known as the Bashali, is strictly off-limits to men. Among the hunter-gatherer communities in the Ituri forest of eastern Congo, gender equality is highly valued. A young woman's first menstruation is celebrated with joy and festivity. She is escorted to the Alima hut, a large temple at the heart of the village, where older women provide lessons on relationships and sexuality and teach ancient songs. Once the girls leave the hut, they go on a playful warpath using big whipping sticks to chase after boys. If a boy is whipped, he must try to pass the older women and enter the Alima hut. In Australia, young Aboriginal women spend time in menstrual huts built by their mothers, and once their period is over, they bathe in the river and the hut is burned. Over time, many patriarchal societies have used menstrual separation as a tool for oppression. Today, Jewish women in the Ethiopian highlands must remain in a hut for 7 days during their menstrual cycle, where they are only allowed to cook coffee and roasted grains. The experiences of these women vary. Some report discomfort, cold, and hunger, while others enjoy the social interaction and rest. In western Nepal, Hindu women stay in small windowless huts called kyopatis for 5 days during their period, while girls experiencing their first menstruation must remain for at least 14 days. This practice forces many young women to miss school, and tragically, dozens of women and girls die in these huts each year due to snake bites, assault, exposure to freezing temperatures, and suffocation from lack of ventilation. Despite a 2005 ruling by Nepal's Supreme Court to outlaw the practice, it is still not widely enforced. In medieval Europe, blood was viewed as a toxic substance. Menstrual blood, in particular, was believed to carry dangerous contaminants, and it was even thought that drinking it could cause leprosy. Midwives, though offering herbal remedies for painful periods, kept such knowledge secret, as the Church preached that menstrual discomfort, like the pain of childbirth, was a punishment for Eve's original sin. Women's attire reflected these beliefs. wearing pants was considered improper for women, who instead wore layers of skirts with open undergarments, allowing for air circulation. In the 1700s, male doctors took over gynecology, pushing aside midwives and branding them as unsanitary. These doctors did little to understand women's experiences, instead making assumptions about their health. The medical community largely ignored women's input on their own health. The early 1800s saw the rise of bloomers, a new fashion that allowed women to relieve themselves without removing layers of clothing. Women would use cotton and flannel strips to absorb menstrual blood. And with the invention of rubber in the 1850s, sanitary aprons or rubber strips began to be used to manage menstruation. Clothes intended to prevent staining often trapped bacteria, which worsened odor and caused rashes and infections. In the late 1800s, the Hoosier sanitary belt was invented. This waistband allowed washable pads to be clipped in and run through the legs. While they were an improvement over loose rags and diapers, they remained bulky and uncomfortable. Despite this, manufacturers didn't create a better solution, and they stayed in widespread use until the 1970s. By the late 1800s, more women were entering the workforce, attending universities, and pushing for the right to vote. Men who opposed female progress attempted to use menstruation as a scientific argument against women's equal participation in these areas. Dr. James McGregor Allen argued that men would always surpass women in intellectual labor because nature didn't periodically interrupt their thoughts. Health reformer and cornflake enthusiast John Harvey Kellogg advised that women should completely rest during menstruation, while Harvard professor Edward H. Clark claimed that the physical and mental strain of a college education was too much for women, especially during their periods. He suggested that menstruating women should stay home and rest in bed instead of attending lectures. Interestingly, no one suggested that working-class women should spend their periods resting in bed rather than working. Misogynistic pseudoscientist Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby conducted a groundbreaking scientific study on the matter. She collected extensive physiological data, including muscle strength tests on women throughout their menstrual cycles. Her 1876 research paper concluded that menstruation did not require rest and that women were healthiest when they were mentally engaged and physically active. Jacoby disproved Clark's claims and was awarded the Boylston Medical Prize from his university, Harvard. However, despite this scientific breakthrough, the taboos surrounding menstruation persisted. During World War I, nurses discovered that cellucotton, a type of inexpensive bandage made from wood pulp, was highly effective in absorbing menstrual blood. After the war, the private sector purchased the surplus bandages and repackaged them as Kotex disposable pads, which were introduced in 1920. Initially, they didn't catch on right away, as women were embarrassed to buy them in drugstores. To address this, stores set up tables with Kotex wrapped in plain brown packaging, allowing women to discreetly purchase them for a nickel. In Ethiopia, steam baths using herb smoke were common. In drier regions like those inhabited by the San people, ash or clay replaced water for cleaning. African homes were frequently cleaned and even replastered with mixtures of dung and clay, materials that, once dried, formed smooth, insect-repelling, odorless surfaces. What might seem gross was often quite practical. Across the Americas, indigenous peoples also embraced cleanliness. Sweat lodges, enclosed huts with heated stones and steam, were used by many native tribes from Canada to Central America. This was both a spiritual and hygienic practice. The Aztecs and Maya used temazcals, sweat baths, sometimes attached to homes or temples. The Aztecs bathed frequently, even daily. Emperor Montezuma reportedly bathed in rivers or palace pools. Soaps from plant roots and perfumes from vanilla, orchids, and copal were used to stay fresh. Spanish conquistadors were stunned by this. Some chroniclers noted that the Aztecs had no body odor and bathed regularly, while the Europeans were the ones who smelled offensive. Ironically, as colonization progressed, indigenous hygiene standards often declined under European influence, though traditional practices like sweat lodges endured. In East Asia, particularly Japan, bathing was historically important. Influenced by Shinto purification rituals and later Buddhism, Japan developed a strong bathing culture. Communal baths like the sento, public bathhouse, and furo, hot tub, were widespread. By the Edo period, 1600s to 1800s, most townsfolk bathed daily, far more than their European counterparts. Even earlier, people used hot springs or heated bathtubs. Cleanliness became associated with etiquette, which may explain why Japan avoided some of the devastating disease outbreaks that plagued less hygienic societies. Southeast Asian cultures in tropical climates also bathed frequently. The ancient Khmer Empire in Cambodia constructed massive water reservoirs and tanks, likely used for both irrigation and communal bathing. Across warm regions, frequent water bathing was easier and more comfortable. In contrast, colder climates saw people avoid water and rely more on steam or layered clothing to manage hygiene. Throughout all these examples, culture and religion deeply influenced hygiene. For some, cleanliness was sacred. For others, excessive washing was seen as vain or dangerous. Many of our ancestors used bizarre but clever methods: ashes, clay, fat, herbs, smoke, or simply scrubbing to stay clean. Over time, trial and error revealed what worked. As understanding of disease transmission improved, sanitation evolved, bringing us to today's standards.